The Doll Maker. Chapter 1. Arrival in New Harmony. A chill autumn breeze rustled the crimson leaves around Sarah's feet as she stepped out of her car, stretching her stiff limbs gratefully. The quaint cottage before her, its white clapboard siding pristine under the waning afternoon sun, seemed the perfect refuge from her troubles back in Chicago. New Harmony. Even the name held a certain allure, a promise of solace and new beginnings. Sarah inhaled deeply, letting the crisp country air fill her lungs, and felt some of the heaviness that had dogged her since the traumatic events of last spring begin to dissipate. "Miss Larkin?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah turned to see an elderly woman making her way up the path, her white hair catching the golden light. "I'm Mrs. Price, the landlady. Welcome to Harmony Cottage." Sarah smiled, taking the proffered key. "Thank you. It's even lovelier than I imagined from the photos." "Been in my family for generations," Mrs. Price said proudly, ushering Sarah inside the tidy, sun-dappled interior. "Fixed it up myself after my Harold passed. It's got quite the storied history, you know. They say one of the founders of the town's utopian community once lived here." As Mrs. Price chatted on about the cottage's provenance, Sarah let her gaze wander over the antique furnishings, the porcelain knickknacks on the mantelpiece. It was like stepping into a sepia-toned photograph, a portal to a forgotten time. Something about the atmosphere of New Harmony was already working its magic on her, soothing her raw nerves. Perhaps here, far from the ghosts of her past, she could finally begin to heal, rebuild her life, and maybe even rediscover her passion for historical research that had been so brutally interrupted. Mrs. Price finally took her leave with a kind smile and a promise of blueberry scones in the morning. Alone at last, Sarah collapsed onto the soft four-poster bed, exhaustion washing over her. Just as she was drifting off, a fleeting thought flickered through her mind unbidden. A snippet from one of the dusty tomes on New Harmony's origin she'd perused on the long drive from Chicago. Something about the darker undercurrents beneath the town's utopian facade. Whispers of strange, occult practices, unsettling folk traditions. Sarah shook her head, dispelling the notion. Likely just rumors and hearsay, the kind that always seemed to sprout up around isolated communities with eccentric histories. Nothing to trouble her idyllic new beginning. Still, as sleep claimed her, she couldn't quite shake the prickle of unease at the base of her spine, like icy fingers trailing over her skin, hinting at secrets yet to be uncovered in the winding streets of this strange little hamlet. Chapter 2. The Doll Maker's House. Morning dawned crisp and golden over New Harmony, the rising sun painting the Wabash River in shades of molten amber. Sarah woke feeling more refreshed than she had in months, the nightmares that usually plagued her conspicuously absent. After a leisurely breakfast of Mrs. Price's promised scones, Sarah set out to explore the town proper, armed with a hand-drawn map from her landlady. The air was redolent with wood smoke and the sweet decay of fallen leaves as she wandered the picturesque streets, drinking in the historical charm. Towering oaks and maples lined the cobbled avenues, their canopies ablaze in fall colors. Stately Georgian and federal-style homes rubbed shoulders with quaint artisanal shops and cafes, many bearing plaques detailing their roles in New Harmony's dual utopian experiments. It was like walking through a living museum, history whispering from every brick and gable. As she rounded a corner onto Main Street, one storefront in particular caught Sarah's eye. Nestled between the old-fashioned barber shop and a dusty antique store was a squat, eerie-looking Victorian house, its once vibrant facade now a dull, peeling gray. A weathered sign hung above the door, H. Thorne, Master Doll Maker, Eastern 1892. Sarah felt an inexplicable shiver ripple through her as she studied the unsettling display in the front bay window. A collection of antique porcelain dolls, their glassy eyes seeming to follow her every move. She'd always found dolls a bit creepy, with their frozen, uncanny expressions. But there was something uniquely disturbing about these specimens. Morbid curiosity drew her closer despite the unease prickling at her nape. The dolls' pallid bisque faces were incredibly lifelike, almost luminous in their detail, like little preservations of long-dead children, eerily unchanging while the world aged around them. And at the center of the tableau, poised as if in a place of honor, was the most breathtaking doll of all. A young woman in an exquisite Victorian gown of ivory lace and silk, an expression of remote, melancholy beauty on her delicate features. Waist-length mahogany hair framed a rose-petal mouth and huge, soulful eyes. Sarah blinked, her heart stuttering in her chest. Eyes the precise shade of rich whiskey brown as her own. A face with the same dusting of freckles across the nose, the same full lower lip and gently pointed chin. It was like staring into a mirror through the wavering lens of time. The doll couldn't be mistaken for anything other than Sarah's uncanny double, as if some forgotten Larkin ancestor had modeled for the esoteric craftsman over a century ago. With trembling fingers, Sarah snapped a photo of the unsettling figure on her phone, unnerved to her core. Who was this mystery woman? What was her connection to New Harmony's enigmatic doll maker? And why, despite the bright mid-morning sun, did an icy dread still cling to Sarah's spine, as if the doll's painted eyes had imparted some dire warning she couldn't yet comprehend? The questions churned in her mind as she hurried back to the safety of Harmony Cottage, desperate to learn more. Chapter 3. The First Murder. Sarah spent the rest of the day ensconced in Harmony Cottage's cozy study nook, consumed by her research into New Harmony's macabre doll maker. The unsettling photo of her Victorian doppelganger stared back at her from the laptop screen as she combed the internet for any scrap of information on H. Thorne and his uncanny creations. Details were scant and shrouded in rumor. Thorne, it seemed, had been a reclusive artisan operating on the fringes of New Harmony society at the turn of the 20th century. Whispers painted him as an eccentric obsessed with breathing lifelike qualities into his dolls, and darker intimations hinted that his methods may not have been entirely ethical. Several lurid message board threads referenced old legends of Thorne employing surgically removed human elements in his work, but the claims were unsubstantiated. Sarah shook her head. Likely just morbid urban folklore cooked up to spice the town's history. Still, she couldn't deny the dolls possessed a nauseatingly vivid aura. Her concentration was broken by an urgent knocking at the cottage door. Frowning, Sarah opened it to find Mrs. Price on the stoop, her kindly face ashen. "Miss Larkin," she began, wringing her hands, "I'm afraid there's been a terrible incident in town." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "A body was discovered down by the old mill pond early this morning," Mrs. Price whispered. "A young woman, brutally murdered. The police are saying—" She swallowed convulsively, her voice dropping to a strangled rasp. "They're saying parts of her were removed, just carved out like a butcher with a slab of meat. And the wounds, they said it looked as if they'd been stitched back up in preparation for some sort of preservation, like a mortician dressing a corpse for viewing." Bile surged into Sarah's throat, her mind reeling. She thought of the doll's uncannily lifelike skin, the old rumors swirling around Thorne's unconventional materials. It couldn't be. Mrs. Price was still talking, ashen. "It's just so shocking. Things like this don't happen in a place like New Harmony." Sarah barely heard her. A grim resolve had planted itself in her gut, joining with the dark fascination that had gripped her since the moment she'd laid eyes on those haunting familiar features in the doll maker's window. There was a rot lurking beneath New Harmony's placid surface, some twisted secret born in the shadows of its strange history. And she would not rest until she dragged the truth into the unforgiving light, no matter how ugly or horrifying it might be. Heart-pounding, Sarah thanked Mrs. Price and rushed inside to grab her coat. She needed answers, starting with the mysterious provenance of H. Thorne's most unsettling and personal creation, the doll with her face. Chapter 4. Digging into the Archives. The Working Men's Institute loomed before Sarah, its stolid brick facade exuding a certain aged gravitas. According to Mrs. Price, this unassuming edifice housed New Harmony's public library and historical archives, the most comprehensive record of the town's serpentine past. If answers about the doll maker and his eerily familiar muse were to be found anywhere, it would be within these hushed, book-lined walls. Sarah scaled the steps and slipped inside, the door closing behind her with a muffled thud. The interior was dim and cavernous, smelling of old paper and polished oak. Towering shelves stretched into the shadows, packed tight with leather-bound tomes. Sarah approached the circulation desk, where a wizened old librarian was bent over an antique card catalog. "Excuse me," she began, pulling out her phone. "I was hoping you might be able to help me find some information on this." She showed him the photo of the uncanny doll and watched as his roomy eyes widened in recognition. "Ah," he murmured, a curious mix of reverence and unease in his voice. "One of Old Man Thorne's more unsettling creations. Said to bear a most unusual resemblance to his only child, a daughter who died tragically young." Sarah's heart skipped. The doll was modeled on Thorne's daughter? But the similarity to her own features. "What can you tell me about her?" she asked, trying to steady the tremor in her words. The librarian stroked his wispy beard, contemplative. "Not much, I'm afraid. Thorne was a notorious recluse, and his personal life is shrouded in mystery. What little we do know is cobbled together from whispers and hearsay." He gestured for Sarah to follow him into the stacks. "But there may be some illumination to be found in our archives. Thorne's workshop was a source of dark fascination for many in town. I recall a few intrepid souls even recorded their impressions." He stopped before a sagging shelf near the back of the library, running a gnarled finger over the dusty spines until he found what he was seeking. With a grunt, he pulled free a yellowed, crumbling scrapbook and pressed it into Sarah's hands. "Journals and news clippings related to Thorne, gathered by an amateur historian in the 30s, he explained. "Perhaps they hold a clue to your query." Sarah thanked him and found a quiet corner to pore over the fragile pages. A thrill of dark anticipation raced down her spine as she opened the musty cover and felt her breath catch as she came face to face with the first clipping. It was an old black and white photograph, grainy and faded, but the central figure was unmistakable. The same young woman from the doll, Thorne's daughter, and Sarah's mirror image from another life. She was standing before the doll-maker's shop, a melancholy aura clinging to her like a shroud. But it was the caption that turned Sarah's blood to ice water in her veins. "Claudia Thorne," it read, "vanished without a trace on All Hallows Eve, 1898. Body never recovered." Sarah swallowed hard against the dread knotting her stomach. A terrible suspicion was brewing in her mind, fed by the grisly rumors and the uncanny craftsmanship of Thorne's dolls. What dark arts had the reclusive doll maker employed to conjure such macabre realism? And what did Claudia's disappearance have to do with the eerie figure bearing her likeness? As she scanned the rest of the scrapbook with mounting unease, a chilling theory began to coalesce. Whispers of the utopian founder's secret occult practices leapt out at her, along with cryptic references to unorthodox materials used in Thorne's workshop, materials that may have required a human harvest to obtain. Sarah shuddered, the archive suddenly feeling suffocating, sinister. She needed some air to clear her head, to process the magnitude of what she was uncovering. Gathering up the scrapbook, she hurried out into the wan afternoon light, the librarian's knowing gaze boring into her back. He knew more than he let on, she was certain. Everyone in this town likely harbored some piece of this grotesque puzzle, even if they didn't quite realize the full picture it formed. A picture Sarah was beginning to fear she knew all too well. The brewing horror that had drawn her to New Harmony in the first place, as inextricable as a silken strand of fate. She just prayed she was strong enough to face the nightmare when it finally, dreadfully clicked into place. Chapter 5. Eyes Watching. Sarah woke with a shuddering gasp, momentarily disoriented. The cramped attic room of Harmony Cottage slowly resolved around her, but the terrors from her nightmare still clung to the edges of her vision like tattered cobwebs. All too familiar visions of glassy doll eyes, of flayed skin stretched over porcelain, twisted Frankenstein-esque creations with her own face, beautiful and bloodless. She'd been plagued by a sense of being watched, stalked through New Harmony's quaint streets, by both Thorne's eldritch creations and some darker, malevolent presence. The awful weight of destiny, of a horrific fate she couldn't escape. "Get a grip, Larkin," Sarah admonished herself, wiping cold sweat from her brow. The last few days of obsessive research were clearly taking their toll. Ever since the grisly murder and her excavation of the scrapbook, she'd been consumed by a need to unravel New Harmony's darkest secrets. Consequences be damned. She glanced at the clock, groaning. Only 2 a.m. Too much nightmare fuel swirling in her brain to have any hope of getting back to sleep. With a resigned sigh, she padded downstairs and puttered around the kitchen, fixing a mug of chamomile tea. As she waited for the water to boil, Sarah couldn't shake the prickle of eyes on her back. The same unnerving sensation from her dream, of being observed by unseen voyeurs. She spun around, scanning the dark corners of the cottage. Nothing but shadows. "Get it together," she warned herself. "You'll drive yourself crazy, seeing ghosts and boogeymen around every corner." A sudden bang from outside made her jump, sloshing hot tea over her hand. Heart in her throat, Sarah peered through the lace curtains. A lone figure was moving furtively down the deserted street, something bulky clutched under its arm. At this hour, in a sleepy hamlet like New Harmony, suspicion trilled down Sarah's spine. Before she could second-guess herself, she was out the door, following the shadowy form at a careful distance. Main Street was eerie and still, lit only by a few guttering street lamps. The figure ahead of her, a man she could see now, tall and gaunt, kept a brisk pace, clearly on a mission. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized where his purposeful steps were leading. The dollmaker's house. Of course. Sarah ducked into an alley as the man reached the shop's door, glancing around surreptitiously before producing an old-fashioned key. There was a soft click, and then he vanished into the murky interior, prize still clutched under his arm. What was he up to, skulking around Thorne's former sanctum in the dead of night? A hollow feeling swelled in Sarah's gut, the unmistakable intuition of a lurking threat. She thought of the murder victim, of the gruesome violations inflicted on her corpse, the removed body parts, the meticulous stitching, preparations for some unthinkable act of preservation. Just like the whispered rumors about Thorne's methods, a grim hypothesis crystallized in Sarah's mind, fed by the past day's discoveries. What if the dollmaker's twisted legacy hadn't ended with his death? What if some new acolyte had taken up the mantle, continuing his macabre work? It would explain the uncanny resemblance of the antique doll to the recent murder. A template, guiding unholy rituals under the shroud of New Harmony's history. Sarah was moving before the thought had fully formed, seized by a wild recklessness. She had to know the truth, had to see what dark purpose had drawn the stranger to Thorne's lair tonight. The door was surprisingly unlocked, yielding easily under Sarah's trembling hand. She crept inside the musty foyer, senses straining. From deep within the shop, she heard a muffled thump, the clink of metal on metal. Her phantom host, engaged in his sinister tasks. Heart hammering, she tiptoed down the dark hallway, flinching as the ancient floorboards creaked underfoot. Ahead, a dim glow spilled from a half-open door, flickering like foxfire. The noises were louder now, wet, organic sounds that turned Sarah's stomach. She reached the threshold, hardly daring to breathe. Steeling herself, she peered around the doorframe and nearly screamed at the gruesome tableau laid bare within. A hidden workshop, cluttered with all the bygone trappings of Thorne's terrible arts. Yellowed anatomical charts papered the walls, depicting the human form flayed open with cold precision. Antique surgical implements gleamed on blood-stained trays, poised for butchery. And there, hunched over a scarred wooden slab, was the shadowy man. His back was to Sarah, but she could see the awful focus of his movements as he labored over something obscured by his wiry frame, something that looked horribly, dreadfully familiar. Praying she was wrong, Sarah inched forward, craning for a better look, just as her foot found a loose board. The resultant squeal of wood was deafening in the sepulchral hush. The man whirled, his gaunt face a rictus of shock and fury. Sarah barely had time to register the gleaming scalpel in his crimson-streaked hand before he lunged, unholy purpose etched in every line of his body. She bolted, a scream trapped in her constricting throat. The man's footsteps thundered behind her as she fled back through the labyrinthine house, his rasping breaths hot on her neck. Sarah's mind was a white buzz of panic, her single coherent thought a desperate plea to the uncaring night. "Let me live! Oh God, please let me live!" She burst out of the shop and onto the street, the pursuer's grasping fingers missing her collar by inches. Blind with terror, Sarah sprinted for the dubious safety of Harmony Cottage, the world narrowing to the slap of her feet on cobblestone, and the whoosh of her own blood in her ears. Only when she'd thrown the bolt on her door did she let herself crumple, great shuddering sobs racking her frame. She'd escaped the dollmaker's heir, but for how long? He knew her now, knew she'd seen the terrible secrets behind his art. The image of his workbench swam in her mind's eye, nausea rising in her gorge. For in that suspended moment of revelation, Sarah had glimpsed all too clearly the focus of his dark attentions tonight. A ghastly, half-finished doll, its bisque face a delicate echo of the murdered girl's features. Thorne's blasphemous techniques, reborn in a new generation of horror. Sarah shook with the knowledge, the awful truth she could no longer ignore. A killer walked the tranquil lanes of New Harmony, and he would surely stop at nothing to protect his unspeakable purpose, even if it meant consigning her to the same fate as his unfortunate model. Sarah gritted her teeth against the howl of despair building in her breast. She was in this town for a reason, her steps guided by a hand beyond her reckoning. And hell or high water, she would see that reason through. For the murdered girl, for her own lost innocence, for the dark history of this place that bred such exquisite monsters in the guise of men. Chapter 6. The Librarian's Warning. The morning dawned wan and cheerless, a perfect match for Sarah's bleak state of mind. Dark portents pressed down on her like a shroud, the cavernous eye sockets of Thorne's half-finished doll, the murderous gleam in the stranger's gaze as he'd pursued her through the sepulchral gloom of the workshop. Her close brush with the doll-maker's heir had shaken her to the core, a visceral reminder of the stakes at play. This was no mere historical mystery to be unraveled from the safety of dusty archives and quaint antique shops. The rot that had seeded itself in New Harmony's past had borne deadly fruit in the present, a malignancy that threatened to consume her whole. Common sense urged Sarah to cut her losses, to flee this hamlet and its ghosts before she became just another morbid footnote in the ledger of Thorne's legacy. But a stronger impulse stayed her hand, an unshakable conviction that she was meant to see this grim business through. For reasons she couldn't fully articulate, even to herself, Sarah knew her fate was now inextricably bound to that of the murdered girl, and to the terrible truth lurking beneath New Harmony's placid facade. Grim purpose firming her spine, Sarah dressed and left Harmony Cottage, making a beeline for the one place that might hold a crucial piece of the puzzle: the Working Men's Institute and its cryptic steward of New Harmony's history. The librarian was bent over a crumbling tome as she entered, his expression unreadable. He glanced up at her approach, rheumy eyes sharpening with an unsettling acuity. "Back so soon, Miss Larkin? I'd think you'd had your fill of our quaint hamlet's secrets." Sarah swallowed, the weight of the old man's stare heavy on her skin. Did he know something of what she'd witnessed in the necropolis of the doll-maker's house? "I need your help," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I think I've stumbled onto something terrible lurking in New Harmony's past, and I fear it may have resurfaced in the present, with deadly consequences." The librarian leaned back, steepling his gnarled fingers. "Go on." The tale spilled out of Sarah in fits and starts. The uncanny doll with her likeness, the grotesque murder, her dark sojourn in Thorne's workshop, and the gaunt stranger laboring over a new blasphemy. Through it all, the old man listened in inscrutable silence, his weathered face betraying no hint of surprise or dismay. When she'd finished, he simply sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of years. "I fear you've awoken something best left slumbering, Miss Larkin. A evil born in the shadows of this town's utopian dreams, nurtured by the hubris of men who thought themselves above the natural order." He fixed her with a piercing stare. "You know of what I speak, I think. The occult dabblings of New Harmony's founders, whispers of rituals and rites meant to breach the veil between life and death." Sarah nodded, a chill tracing her spine. The scrapbook's oblique references to the utopian's secret practices, the unspoken implications woven between the lines of Thorne's sinister legend. The librarian continued, his voice dropping to a sepulchral rasp. "Thorne was a student of those forbidden arts, you see. He sought to imbue his creations with an unnatural semblance of life, a perverse echo of the divine act. And the price for such hubris," he trailed off, gaze distant. "Some transgressions carry a stain that ripples through generations, Miss Larkin. A hereditary taint, passed down like a curse. I fear the one you encountered in Thorne's lair is the inheritor of that dark legacy, and he will not rest until he has reclaimed what he sees as his birthright." Sarah's blood ran cold. The half-finished doll on the mad artisan's workbench, its pallid features already taking on the likeness of his latest victim, an offering to whatever unspeakable pact bound him to Thorne's memory. "What can I do?" she asked, hating the quaver in her words. How do I stop him? The librarian shook his head, something like pity ghosting across his careworn face. I cannot guide you further down this path, Miss Larkin. The secrets you seek carry their own peril, and their revelation may damn you as surely as they damn the one you hunt. He reached out, clasping her hand in his own papery grip. But know this, the truth will out one way or another. Let that be your lodestone in the dark days to come. With that cryptic pronouncement, the old man withdrew, leaving Sarah alone with the specters of history and her own churning dread. A sudden conviction crystallized in her mind, fed by the librarian's grim auguries. To unravel this mystery, to lay the murdered girl's ghost to rest, she would have to venture into the very heart of Thorne's legacy. She would have to breach the dread sanctum of his lair and confront the inheritor of his dark arts, even at the risk of her own soul. For she knew now, with a certainty that echoed in her bones, that her destiny was etched in the faces of those eldritch dolls, a fate that would not be denied no matter how she struggled against it. Squaring her shoulders, Sarah left the library, purpose firming her step. She had preparations to make, a terrible reckoning to plan. And may God have mercy on them both when that reckoning finally came due. Chapter 7. Hidden Room. Sarah sat hunched over the rickety desk in Harmony Cottage's tiny spare room. The detritus of her investigation spread before her like the pieces of a macabre puzzle. Photocopies of old news articles, grainy snapshots of the doll-maker's unsettling creations, pages of feverishly scribbled notes, all of them swirling around the uncanny image of the antique doll that wore her face like an ill-fitting mask. Claudia Thorne, the caption whispered from another century, vanished without a trace on All Hallows' Eve. An innocent sacrificed on the altar of her father's dark obsessions, if Sarah's dire hypothesis was correct. She scrubbed a hand over her exhaustion-bruised eyes, trying to marshal her chaotic thoughts. Every scrap of evidence, every half-muttered rumor and dead-end lead, kept circling back to one inescapable conclusion. The rot at the heart of New Harmony, the stain left by Thorne's unspeakable acts, had never truly been expunged. It had only gone dormant, waiting patiently over the long, fallow decades for the right vessel to quicken it back to deadly purpose. And now, with an heir to carry on the dollmaker's work, that purpose had emerged from the shadows once more, fed by the same secrets and perversities that had set Thorne himself on the path to damnation. Grim certainty settled in Sarah's gut. If she had any hope of stopping this horror, of saving the next chosen victim from an artisan's unhallowed preservation, she would have to strike at the source. She had to find a way inside Thorne's sanctum and confront the twisted soul laboring in his footsteps, even if it meant putting herself directly in the monster's sights. Before she could lose her nerve, Sarah gathered up the most pertinent bits of her research and headed for the door. She had no real plan, only a desperate compulsion to act before another innocent paid the price for her hesitation. Main Street was deserted as she marched towards the brooding hulk of the dollmaker's house, her pulse a martial drum in her ears. The sheer reckless folly of what she intended to do screamed at her from some last bastion of self-preservation, urging her to turn back before it was too late. Sarah ignored it, eyes fixed on her foreboding destination. Turn back to what? A lifetime of looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past's dark tendrils to snake out and ensnare her once more. No, best to face this madness head-on and let the devil take the hindmost. The shop's front door yielded easily to her touch, unlocked. Hardly a surprise, given the clandestine nature of the work occurring within. Sarah slipped inside, senses straining against the gloom. From the depths of the old house, she heard a muted thump, the now familiar sounds of the killer engaged in his sinister rituals. Sending up a silent prayer, Sarah followed the noises, past the antique menagerie of Thorne's creations, and into the claustrophobic hallway she'd fled down just a night ago. The door to the hidden workshop stood ajar, an aurora of lamplight limning its edges in sickly gold. Heart in her throat, she crept towards it, all too aware of the danger lurking on the other side. One wrong move, one errant creak of a floorboard, and she would be at the mercy of a man who knew none. Holding her breath, Sarah peered through the narrow gap and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. The room was empty, the killer's workbench bare save for a few ominous smears of rust brown. No sign of the gaunt stranger or his grim handiwork, but something else snagged Sarah's attention. dread uncoiling in her belly. There, on the far wall, nearly obscured by anatomical diagrams and half-finished doll components, a rough-hewn door leading deeper into the bowels of the building. How had she missed it during her first frantic incursion? Hardly daring to breathe, Sarah pushed into the room, drawn towards the ominous portal as if by an unseen hand. An awful certainty crystallized in her mind with each leaden step. Whatever secrets lay beyond that door, whatever horrors the heir to Thorne's legacy had secreted away, therein lay the key to all the mysteries bedeviling her. She had to know, even if it damned her, even if it shattered the last of her illusions about the true depths of human depravity. The door swung open at her touch, a gaping maw leading into shadow. Sweat slicked Sarah's palms as she fumbled for the flashlight app on her phone, heart a wild staccato in her breast. The feeble beam bloomed, pushing back the gloom, and the breath left her in a rush. A narrow flight of stone steps greeted her, leading down into a lightless abyss. The air held an unnatural chill, ripe with the fedor of forgotten secrets and ancient death. Some primal intuition gibbered a warning, every instinct screaming for Sarah to turn tail and flee this charnel pit before it was too late. But beneath the fear, an even stronger pull. The pull of a mystery that would not let her rest until she'd unraveled it to its very bones, no matter the cost. Steeling herself, Sarah descended, phone held before her like a talisman. The stairs curved sharply, plunging her deeper into the subterranean dark. How far down did this passage wind, and what eldritch sights awaited at its terminus? Images of medieval oubliettes and mad scientists' lairs flitted through her mind, each more outlandish than the last. But even in her wildest imaginings, Sarah could never have dreamt of the tableau that greeted her when she finally reached the bottom. The stairs opened into a cavernous chamber, its contours lost in shadow. But Sarah barely registered the room itself, transfixed by the nightmarish spectacle dominating its center. Specimen jars, dozens of them, glinting dully in the glow of her phone. A grotesque collection of disembodied anatomy, human and animal alike, suspended in murky fluids. Eyeballs stared glassily from embalming solutions, tongues and viscera curled obscenely within their transparent prisons. And there, nestled among the grim trophies, dolls, scores of them, each more unsettling than the last, their porcelain features rendered in uncanny detail. Doll after doll stared out at Sarah with knowing eyes, a congregation of soulless voyeurs silently accusing. Choking back a scream, she staggered back, fighting the urge to retch. What madness was this? What unholy marriage of science and occultism birthed such eldritch fruit in the darkness beneath an antique shop? The answer hung before her, terrible in its stark simplicity. Thorne's legacy, stripped of all pretense and laid bare in gut-churning clarity. This was no mere workshop of a reclusive eccentric, no artisanal pursuit taken to morbid extremes. This was a charnel house, a repository of forbidden knowledge and unspeakable transgressions. The sanctum of a man who had long ago eschewed the last trappings of humanity in his pursuit of the ultimate perversion. Pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The uncanny, lifelike quality of the dolls, the hushed rumors of unorthodox materials used in their creation. Thorne had made himself a student of the utopian founder's occult obsessions and surpassed his mentors in the depths of his blasphemies. He had sought to create the perfect doll, an effigy indistinguishable from a living being. And in his unholy quest, he had shattered every taboo, violated every natural law that stood in his way. These specimen jars, these grim trophies, all of them offerings on the altar of his dark arts, a sacrifice of flesh and fluid to the unquiet gods of his own devising. How many had been harvested for this terrible purpose, carved up piecemeal to lend their essence to Thorne's soulless progeny? Claudia Thorne's vanishing, so close to her doll's completion, had she been the first, the genesis of a mania that only deepened as the decades crept by? And what of Thorne's faceless heir, the gaunt figure even now following in his forebear's bloody footsteps? How many would sate his cruel appetites before he achieved the singular work he believed to be his birthright? Sarah swayed, gorge rising in her throat. She thought of the half-finished doll on the killer's workbench, its pallid features already resolving into the likeness of the murdered girl. Another lamb for the slaughter, another canvas for the doll-maker's grotesque arts. She wanted to run, to flee this pit of abominations and never look back. But a deeper conviction stayed her, an unshakable sense that she alone could halt this horror before it claimed more innocent lives. The key lay here in Thorne's ghastly reliquary, some vital clue to his methods, his madness, that would arm her for the confrontation to come. She had to find it, had to understand the twisted path that led a man to barter his very humanity for the sake of his obsessions. Hands shaking, Sarah moved deeper into the chamber, phone sweeping over the gruesome displays like a portable sun. She schooled her features into a mask of clinical detachment, determined to examine the evidence before her with an investigator's dispassionate eye. Shelf after shelf of dolls crowded the room's periphery, each more disquieting than the last. Their dead gazes seemed to track Sarah as she passed, a silent accusation boring into her back. But it was the specimens in their bubbling tanks that drew her attention, a morbid fascination pulling her closer, despite the screaming of her every instinct. Organs and limbs drifted in the clouded solutions, a grotesque aquarium of harvested flesh. The remains of Thorne's unfortunate models, Sarah realized with a surge of nausea, all the intimate details stripped from their still-breathing forms and distilled into a dispiriting pudding. But there was an undeniable artistry to the preservation, a perverse sort of reverence in the way each piece had been prepared and displayed. This was no mere charnel bric-a-brac, no abattoir refuse haphazardly collected. Every jar, every tank, had been curated with an aesthete's eye and a scientist's precision. Thorne had been a man possessed, driven by a mania that transcended all conventional boundaries of morality and taste. But there was a method to his madness, a cold and exacting intellect behind the savagery of his acts. He had been a pioneer in his own way, forging a path into uncharted realms of transgression. And now his scion walked that same path, armed with all the secret knowledge Thorne had died to perfect. A new generation of atrocity, building on the bedrock of old horrors. As Sarah stared into the abyss of his legacy, she felt the weight of all those stolen lives pressing down on her, a burden of blood and suffering crying out for justice. She couldn't turn away, couldn't leave this terrible knowledge to fester in the dark any longer. She had to bring it into the light, had to end this cycle of death and soulless resurrection once and for all, even if it meant sacrificing her own sanity on the altar of the truth. Squaring her shoulders, Sarah turned from the grim relics and made for the stairs, a newfound resolve firming her step. She would find Thorne's heir and confront him, armed with all the awful secrets of his birthright. She would make him answer for every atrocity committed in service to his dark muse, and see this chamber of horrors razed to the very foundations. But even as Sarah ascended back into the shop proper, a trickle of unease wormed through her newfound conviction. She was a stranger here, an interloper blundering into a labyrinth of secrets and old evils. What hope did she have of prevailing against a monster who had been groomed for his role since the cradle? Especially when that role seemed to have been written for her own face, her own form, since long before she drew breath. The doll in the antique shop window, the fate of Claudia Thorne, the uncanny familiarity of this whole benighted town, all of it spiraling around Sarah like a noose of predestination, tightening with every step. She shook off the poison tendrils of doubt, focusing on the task at hand. She couldn't afford to succumb to despair, to let the sheer crushing scope of the horrors she'd uncovered break her nerve. Too much depended on her now. She was the only thing standing between new harmony and a fresh reign of nightmare. Pausing only to lock the hidden door behind her, Sarah slipped out of the dollmaker's house and onto the hushed street. The moon hung bloated and watchful above, its pallid face seeming to mock her through the skeletal lace of the trees. Let it mock, she thought savagely. Let all the powers of hell align themselves against her, and still she would not shrink from this reckoning. She'd follow the bloody threads of Thorne's legacy to whatever dark tapestry they wove, and she'd unravel that tapestry with her own two hands, even if the world burned down around her ears in the process. That was the vow Sarah Larkin made to herself, there in the witch light of a waning October moon. A promise writ in blood and the screams of the unquiet dead, and may God help anyone foolish enough to stand in her way. Chapter 8. The Twisted Legacy. New Harmony's archives swallowed Sarah like a tomb, a silent reliquary of a century's secrets. Rows upon rows of dusty shelves stretched into the shadows, their moldering contents hinting at stories man was never meant to know. Sarah moved down the narrow aisles like a wraith, fingers trailing over the ancient spines, senses primed for any hint of the revelations she sought. Somewhere in this chthonic labyrinth, in the meandering history of this town and its strange denizens, lay the key to unlocking the riddle of Thorne's legacy. And Sarah would have the truth of it, even if it meant upending every dark stone in this repository and letting the red light shine on what scurried beneath. She'd retreated here after her grim discovery in the dollmaker's house, determined to arm herself with knowledge for the trials to come. If she hoped to confront the shade of Thorne's evil, to look his heir in the eye and demand an accounting, she needed to understand the twisted roots of the nightmare she now found herself ensnared in. The town's reclusive librarian had been no help, barely glancing up from his inscrutable tome as Sarah laid out the particulars of her plight. He'd simply waved a gnarled hand toward the stacks, muttering something about seeking where angels fear to tread, then turned back to his reading with a dismissive grunt. So Sarah had dove in head first, poring over old newspaper clippings and crumbling scrapbooks, chasing each scrap of Thorne's history like a gourmand, sucking marrow from a bone. The hours crept by in a haze of yellowed paper and mounting unease, the archive's shadows seeming to lengthen with every damning revelation. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge, a portrait of a man consumed by his darkest compulsions, spiraling ever deeper into the abyss of his own psyche. Thorne had been a prodigy, whispered the faded newsprint, an artisan of unparalleled skill and vision. But there were always intimations of something more, some unsavory undercurrent that set him apart from his peers. Odd stories attached themselves to his name like burrs, tales of unorthodox materials and questionable practices. He worked only at night, some said, and his creations were too uncannily lifelike to be of mortal provenance. Dolls that seemed to watch from the corners of the eye, features contorting in pain or hideous glee when their master's back was turned. Sarah shuddered, the image of Claudia Thorne's pallid effigy swimming before her mind's eye. Had the poor girl been the first to fall victim to her father's unholy vision? The final component needed to elevate his craft into the realm of true nightmare. The thought made bile rise in her throat, but still she pressed on, determined to leave no grim stone unturned. She had to know, had to map the full topology of the evil she now faced. As the night wore on, the revelations grew darker, more disturbing. Oblique references to forbidden texts that vanished from Thorne's workshops after his death, secret correspondences with far-flung esotericists and rogue anatomists, all of them hinting at an obsession that went far beyond the eccentric pursuits of an artistic mind. Hands shaking, Sarah unearthed a slim leather-bound volume from the bowels of the archive, its cracked spine fairly oozing a miasma of secrets. Embossed on the cover in flaking gilt was a single name, Sebastian Thorne. The dollmaker's father, she realized with a thrill of horrified recognition. The first link in this multi-generational chain of atrocities. The journal's pages crackled like old bones as she leafed through them, cramped script spiderwebbing across the parchment. It was a cipher, a madman's screed dense with occult symbols and alchemical formulae, teetering on the knife edge of incoherence. But amid the spilled inkpot of Sebastian's ravings, certain words leapt out at Sarah with a dire, blasphemous clarity. The Anatomist's Vade Mecum, a handbook of corporelinguisis, the Blood Drinker's Compendium, De Secretis Mortuorum, titles that fairly thrummed with a sense of the forbidden, the titles of grimoires ancient and accursed. Had Sebastian Thorne been a dabbler in the black arts, a dilettante of the left-hand path? And had he passed that twisted legacy down to his son, warping an already unquiet mind into something truly monstrous? The implications made Sarah's head spin, a vertiginous whirl of half-glimpsed connections and terrible possibilities. She slumped back against the stacks, fighting to control her galloping breath. God, what had she stumbled into? What eldritch web of secrets and sadism, all spiraling out from one man's unspeakable compulsions? She thought of the killer in the dollmaker's house, the cold calculation in his eyes as he'd worked his ritual scissors. A lifetime of madness, handed down like an heirloom from father to son to misbegotten heir. The sound of a throat clearing shattered the archive's sepulchral hush. Sarah nearly jumped out of her skin, whirling to find the librarian watching her from the shadows between the stacks. Rheumy eyes glinted like chips of flint in the gloom. Pale lips pursed in a moue of knowing disapproval. "Find what you were looking for, miss?" he asked, tone a sandpaper rasp. Sarah held up Sebastian's journal with a trembling hand, a talisman against the old man's piercing gaze. The librarian simply grunted, unsurprised. Ah, yes, the ravings of a lunatic, or the confessions of a monster. Suppose it all depends on your point of view. He tilted his head, studying Sarah like a carrion bird eyeing a potential meal. Though I must say, you seem to have taken quite the interest in our little town's dirty laundry, poking around in affairs that most would consider best left buried. There was no censure in his tone, only a flat sort of appraisal, as if he were gauging just how far down the rabbit hole Sarah was willing to tumble. She met his gaze head-on, chin lifting in defiance. Let him judge her, this cryptic guardian of New Harmony's secrets. She was beyond the petty fears of propriety, the shallow dictates of good taste. When she'd stepped across the threshold of Thorne's hidden chamber, she'd left the daylight world behind, and there could be no going back. I'm not here to pass judgment, Sarah said, voice steady despite the maelstrom raging in her skull. I'm here for the truth, no matter how ugly or damning it might be. The old man's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile devoid of all humor. Truth, is it? Be careful what you wish for, miss. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. Sarah swallowed hard, fingers tightening on the journal. He was right, damn him. The things she'd learned tonight, the implications of Sebastian's whispered secrets, they changed everything, rewrote the very firmament of her understanding, turning black to white and solid ground to quicksand. But what choice did she have? The killer was still out there, Thorne's dark scion laboring to bring his progenitor's grand work to its unholy fruition, and Sarah was the only one who knew, the only one with even a prayer of stopping him before he carved his mark indelibly into the face of her world. No, there could be no turning back. Not anymore. She'd danced this far to the dollmaker's tune. Now she had no choice but to see it through to the bitter end. I appreciate the warning, Sarah said, meeting the librarian's gaze squarely. But I'm afraid I've already crossed that particular Rubicon. For better or worse, I'm in this until the final curtain falls. The old man looked at her for a long moment, something almost like respect kindling in those death's head eyes. Then he simply nodded, melting back into the shadows without another word, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her newfound knowledge and the inescapable sense that she'd just sealed some sort of devil's bargain. So be it, she thought savagely. Let the devil come to collect and be damned. She'd spit in his eye and keep right on walking, straight into the heart of this nightmare. For Claudia Thorne. For all the innocent lives cut short on the altar of one man's grotesque obsessions. And for her own lost self, the woman she'd been before New Harmony's shadow had fallen across her path like a shroud. Sarah closed Sebastian's journal with a snap, the sound a tocsin in the cavernous hush. She slipped it into her bag, a talisman and a promissory note all in one. Then she turned on her heel and strode out of the archives, out into the witch light of a waiting world. Her path was clear now, the signposts of destiny etched in blood and bone. She knew what she had to do, and God help anyone who tried to stop her from seeing it through. Chapter 9. A Second Victim. Dawn crept over New Harmony like a guilty thing, pale fingers of light probing half-heartedly at the sullen hollows of the town. A miasma of unease hung over the waking streets, thick enough to catch in the throat. Word of the brutal murder had spread like brushfire in the night, hushed whispers and wide-eyed speculation crackling along the grapevine. Who was the girl? An out-of-towner, people said, a drifter passing through in search of cheaper thrills. What had been done to her? Unspeakable things, the whispers intimated, violations too obscene for polite conversation. And the question on everyone's lips, unvoiced but thrumming like a rotten tooth, what kind of monster could have committed such an act? What species of evil had taken root in their peaceful hamlet, blossoming in the shadows when no one was watching? Sarah moved through the hubbub like a sleepwalker, numb to the swirl of rumor and dread. She'd stumbled back to Harmony Cottage in the small hours of the morning, Sebastian Thorne's journal burning a hole in her satchel, and fallen into a fitful doze just as the sky began to lighten. Her dreams had been a twisted kaleidoscope of flensed flesh and staring doll eyes, the walls of sleep pressing down like a smothering hand. She'd woken with a scream trapped behind her teeth, the memory of phantom knives trailing over her skin. Now, as she drifted down Main Street in the cool light of morning, Sarah felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The things she'd learned in the archives, The secrets she'd pried from the clenched jaws of history, they reverberated in her skull like the tolling of some eldritch bell, an unspeakable fanfare heralding the end of everything she thought she knew. Thorne's dark legacy, handed down like a poisoned chalice from father to son. The killer, his scion and heir, a new generation of nightmare following in those bloody footsteps. And at the center of it all, the dolls, those terrible, beautiful creations, everyone a masterpiece of transgression. Sarah shuddered, hugging her arms to her chest. It was too much, this weight of revelation pressing down on her. Too vast and dreadful to wrap her mind around. A vortex of horror threatening to pull her under. Part of her longed to just give in, to let the tide of madness take her and be done with it. Surely oblivion was preferable to the awful clarity of understanding. But she couldn't, damn it all. Couldn't abandon her quest or the innocent lives hanging in the balance. The killer was still out there, Thorne's soulless progeny laboring to complete his great work. And Sarah was the only one who knew his true face, the only one who could stop him before he made the world his charnel canvas. No, she had to see this through. For Claudia Thorne, for the murdered girl, for all the lost and broken dolls sacrificed on the altar of one man's unholy vision. She owed them that much at least. Squaring her shoulders, Sarah picked up her pace, heading for the one place that might hold some answers. The police station, where even now the town's finest were no doubt flailing in the dark, trying to make sense of a crime that defied all rational explanation. She'd make them see, she vowed, make them understand the true nature of the evil stalking their streets, even if it meant dragging Thorne's legacy kicking and screaming into the cold light of day. The station was a hubbub of activity when Sarah arrived. Uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives milling about with harried purpose. She caught snatches of muted conversation as she navigated the throng, no leads, waiting on the coroner's report. Like nothing I've ever seen. Phrases that sent a chill chasing down her spine, a grim confirmation of her worst suspicions. She was about to approach the front desk and demand an audience with whoever was in charge of the investigation, when a sudden hush fell over the room, the tense buzz of voices trailing off into shocked silence. Sarah turned to see a gurney being wheeled in through the front doors, a sheet-draped form lying atop it with tragic finality. A collective intake of breath soughed through the assembled cops, a susurrus of horrified recognition. Another one, someone murmured, voice thick with disbelief. Jesus wept. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Sarah watched the gurney's inexorable progress, her heartbeat a deafening drum in her ears. A second victim, so soon after the first ... it could only mean one thing. The killer was accelerating, seized by some new mania, driven by a frenzy of purpose now that the end of his grotesque labors was in sight. Sarah's hands knotted into fists at her sides, rage and terror warring for space behind her ribs. How many more would he take, this soulless disciple of Thorne's depravity? How many innocents would be carved up and remade in the image of his perverse ideal? As if in answer, one of the sheet's corners snagged on the gurney's edge, and the fabric slipped, spilling to the floor in a graceful arc, revealing the ruin that had once been a young woman's face, now a mask of blood and abraded flesh. Sarah's gorge rose, black spots swarming her vision. She'd known, on some intuitive level, what manner of atrocity had been worked upon the poor girl. But to see it firsthand, to have the full obscenity of the killer's handiwork laid bare. It was too much, too raw and visceral, a violation of the very fundament of human dignity. What kind of monster could look upon a fellow being and see only raw materials, just soulless meat to be molded according to his whims? The answer hung before her, stark in its depraved simplicity. The same species of monster who'd looked at Claudia Thorne and seen only a component for his greatest creation, who'd sacrificed his own child on the altar of his mania and called it an act of love. A scion bred in bone and blood, nurtured in nightmare, less than human, and so much more. The revelation crashed over Sarah like a frigid wave, blotting out the chaos of the station, the horror of the mutilated corpse, leaving only a cold, crystalline purpose in its wake. She knew what she had to do now, what grim work awaited her, if she truly meant to see this nightmare ended. There could be no more hiding from the truth, no more flinching from the implications of her crusade. If she wanted to stop the killer, to rip out the poisoned root of Thorne's legacy once and for all, she would have to confront him in the very heart of his domain. She would have to descend into the abyss of his creation and pray that she could claw her way back out again, even if it meant sacrificing her own humanity on the altar of necessity, even if it meant becoming the very thing she sought to destroy. With a last shuddering breath, Sarah turned away from the grisly tableau and shouldered her way out of the station, out into the waiting arms of her destiny and the bloody reckoning to come. She had an appointment to keep in the charnel depths of a madman's sanctum, and heaven help her, she meant to see it through, no matter the cost. Chapter 10. Close Call in the Labyrinth. The hedge maze loomed before Sarah like a living thing, its twisting green walls seeming to writhe and shimmer in the guttering light of her torch, an eldritch sentinel guarding the path to revelation or damnation. She'd come to the outskirts of New Harmony on a whisper and a prayer, following the trail of half-glimpsed clues left behind in Thorne's moldering journals. Cryptic references to a sacred labyrinth, a place of contemplation and dark communion where the doll-maker had come to nurture his most unspeakable visions. A place, Sebastian had intimated with obscene relish, where the worthy might still stumble across echoes of his son's genius. Secrets and artifacts too terrible for the daylight world, hidden away in the chthonic depths of the maze. It was a slim lead, based more on fevered intuition than hard evidence. But after the horror of the second murder, the accelerating madness of the killer's spree, Sarah was ready to clutch at any straw, dance to any tune that might bring her closer to her quarry. And if that meant descending into the belly of Thorne's twisted legacy, plumbing the depths of a decades-old evil in search of fresh revelation, then so be it. She was committed now, for better or worse, locked in a death spiral with a monster wearing a man's skin, playing out the endgame of an atrocity half a century in the making. The only way out was through the maze, through the shadows of history, through the very heart of the nightmare that had swallowed her whole. She could only pray she'd still recognize herself when she came out the other side. Steeling herself, Sarah stepped across the threshold and into the labyrinth proper, only to gag as a wave of sweet, rotten putrescence washed over her, the reek of decay and desiccated vegetation. The place was a sepulchre, a green tomb pulsing with grave mold and eldritch secrecy. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself to push deeper into the maze, fighting down the atavistic urge to turn tail and flee back to the relative sanity of the surface world. The walls closed in around her like a fist, sky and civilization vanishing behind a veil of rotting hedges. With each twisting, doubling turn, Sarah felt the outside world receding further and further away, replaced by a crepuscular half-light that seemed to seep from the very stones underfoot. Down and down she spiraled, into a world governed by its own oniric logic, its own cryptic rules and rhymes. Sweat trickled icily down her spine, the close air cloying in her lungs. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, tracked by unseen eyes as she stumbled deeper into the maze's chthonic embrace. 1,000 skittering things seemed to lurk just beyond the edge of perception, cruel intelligences thrumming with a hunger that had nothing to do with the flesh. And then, halfway down a narrow, winding passage, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. A ghostly silhouette darting across the path ahead, there and gone again between one blink and the next. Sarah froze, heartbeat spiking into a panicked tattoo. She hadn't imagined it. Something had been there, watching her from the shadows, stalking her through the eldritch coils of the labyrinth. A grim revenant willed into being by the sheer crushing weight of the place's malignity. Thorne, she thought wildly. Somehow, impossibly, the dollmaker himself had risen from his unquiet grave to confront this trespasser in his sanctum sanctorum, come to drink of her terror, to feast on her sanity, as he'd once suckled the wills and souls of countless pliable dolls, shaped neath his grotesque ministrations. Footsteps suddenly rang out behind her, slow and deliberate. Dolorous echoes tolling her doom, each impact a sickening thud of inevitability. He was coming, the prodigal monster, the lost scion of Thorne's depravity, drawn like a moth to the flame of her trespass. She ran, a stumbling, flailing sprint, bouncing off the twisting hedgerows like a pinball loosed in a midnight arcade. The footsteps accelerated behind her, a steady quick-time march counterpointing her wild flight. He was gaining ground with each turn, each soul-shaking impact. Sarah could hear his breath now, the wet rasp of a hunting thing scenting its quarry's desperation. A sound to turn the bowels to water, to shred the last tattered veils of sanity, and leave only an animal's blind, shrieking panic in its wake. A root caught her ankle and sent her sprawling, fetching up hard against a lichen-crusted stone wall. Pulped vegetation filled her mouth, her nostrils. Somewhere nearby, a nightbird loosed a liquid, mocking trill, the sound like laughter torn from an inhuman throat. Sarah scrambled to her feet, whirling to face her pursuer. He was close now, so close she fancied she could feel the heat of him, the black and hungry aura roiling off his gaunt frame like a miasma. She fumbled for the torch with numb fingers, the feeble light wavering crazily over the path behind her, catching on a flash of pale, carious bone, the white of an eye, the glint of metal, horribly akin to the implements she'd spied on the killer's workbench. And then he was on her, a skeletal hand clamping down on her shoulder with a grip like iron. Sarah screamed, a high, tearing sound lost in the labyrinth's profane folds. She lashed out blindly in the dark, torch falling from nerveless fingers, and jerked awake with a hoarse cry, cracking her head against the stone wall at her back. Gasping, Sarah stared around wildly, torch beams stabbing through the gloom. The hedgerows loomed on all sides, silent and unmoving. There was no sign of her pursuer, no trace of the shade that had stalked her through the maze's coils, only the frantic trip hammer of her own heart and the taste of grave dirt thick on her tongue. A dream. It had all been a dream, a phantasm conjured by the eldritch miasma of this place. The footsteps, the glimpse of her hunter, just nocturnal fancies, the effluvia of an overstressed mind. Sarah slumped against the wall, almost weak with relief. She'd fallen asleep, that was all. Dozed off in the hexed twilight of the labyrinth, her exhausted psyche revolting after one too many brushes with sanity-blasting revelation. Gingerly she levered herself to her feet, dusting grave mold and pulped leaves from her clothes. It was hard to tell how long she'd been insensate. An hour, 2, however long, it had been entirely too close a call. If the killer truly was abroad in the maze, drawn by the same whispering clues that had brought her hence. She shuddered, bile rising in her throat. Enough. She'd dallied in this eldritch half-world too long already, let herself be lulled by the siren song of its twisted geometries. It was time to quit this place, before she lost herself entirely in the cracks and chinks of its uncanny architecture. Squaring her shoulders, Sarah cast around for the grubby twist of string she'd used to mark her progress through the hedgerows. There, a glimmer of white, half buried in the moldering vegetation. The breadcrumb trail back to reality, to the sane and solid waking world. She was reaching for the string, fingers outstretched, when a voice spoke from the shadows behind her, a voice like the scratch of a scalpel on bone, flensing the last vestiges of hope and leaving only a blank and pitiless void in its wake. "Looking for this?" Sarah whirled, heart in her throat, and there, dangling the string between long alabaster fingers, was the killer. Thorn's heir, the monster-made flesh. His eyes glittered like chips of jet in the gloom, fathomless pits swallowing the torchlight whole. He smiled, a ghastly rictus that never touched those soulless eyes. And in that moment, Sarah knew she was looking into the face of her own annihilation, the inexorable end of all her striving and suffering. The maze had brought her to him after all, delivered her into the hands of her destroyer, a mouse caught between the paws of a deviant cat. And now there would be a reckoning. Oh yes, a reckoning and a consummation played out in the black heart of Thorn's wicked Eden. Even as the thought crystallized, cold and clear as winter starlight, Sarah felt a terrible numbness stealing over her, a glacial calm, the acceptance of the inevitable. So be it, she thought distantly, a shred of lucidity adrift in a sea of nightmare. If this was to be her end, she would meet it on her feet. She would stare into the abyss unblinking, and let it take her as it would. The killer's smile sharpened, scenting her capitulation. He took a step forward, the old leaves crackling obscenely underfoot. "You should have heeded the labyrinth's warnings, little bird," he breathed, rancid sweetness curling from his lips. "Should have fled this place while you still had a chance. But now, you're mine. Mine, to do with as I please. And oh, the things I'm going to do to you." Sarah closed her eyes, a single tear tracking down her cheek. A prayer, a benediction. And then the darkness rose up to claim her, and she knew no more. Chapter 11. Unraveling the Rituals. She came back to herself in stages, the world seeping in through the cracks of her consciousness, like cold molasses. First the pain, a dull, pervasive ache that seemed to radiate from her very bones. Then the smell, a sweet, cloying rot that caught in the back of the throat and refused to budge. And finally the slow, dawning horror of realization, of memory crashing over her in a frigid wave, shocking her back to full, terrified wakefulness. The maze, the killer, his sibilant whisper in the dark, a promise and a threat entwined. Sarah's eyes snapped open, a scream clawing its way up her throat. She was lying on a hard, cold surface, limbs splayed at awkward angles. A guttering torch cast eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls of the chamber, an ancient space that reeked of blood and forbidden secrets. And there, silhouetted against the flame like a figure from a nightmare, was the killer. He loomed over her, a ghastly specter in the flickering light. A cruel smile played about his thin lips, a rictus of obscene anticipation. "Awake at last, my lovely one," he crooned, voice a sandpaper rasp. "And just in time, too. The hour of our great work is nearly upon us." Sarah struggled to sit up, fighting against the waves of pain and nausea that threatened to pull her under once more. Her wrists and ankles were bound with rough rope, the fibers biting into her skin like vicious teeth. Where am I?" she managed, barely recognizing the thin, thready quaver of her own voice. "What are you going to do to me?" The killer chuckled, a sound like dead leaves scuttling across a tomb. He crouched down beside her, trailing one long, pale finger along the line of her jaw. Sarah shuddered at the touch, his skin cold and clammy against her own. "Where are you?" he mused, eyes glittering with a fanatic light. "Why, you're in the very heart of the labyrinth, sweet Sarah. The sacred space where old Thorn wove his darkest magics and birthed horrors the likes of which the world has never seen." He leaned in closer, breath feathering across her cheek in a putrid caress. "And as for what I'm going to do to you, well, let's just say that you're about to become something more than human, something exquisite." Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest, dread knotting her guts into cold, hard lumps. Exquisite. The same word Thorn had used to describe his crowning creation. The doll that wore Claudia's stolen face, like an obscene trophy. The doll that bore her own uncanny likeness, a message and a memento mori spanning half a century. "No," she whispered, the word tearing itself from her throat like barbed wire. "Please, don't do this. I'm begging you." But the killer was already turning away, ignoring her desperate pleas. He moved to an ancient stone altar at the center of the chamber, its surface stained a dull rust brown with the residue of decades of unspeakable rites. "The time for begging is past, my dear," he said absently, picking up a wicked-looking scalpel from the macabre assortment of tools arrayed on the altar. The blade glinted evilly in the torchlight, honed to a razor's edge. "Now is the time for transcendence, for shedding the chains of the flesh and becoming something more, something eternal." He turned back to Sarah, eyes alight with a hellish rapture. In his free hand, he held an ancient leather-bound tome, its pages crackling with eldritch energy. "And you, my sweet Sarah, you will be the vessel for that transcendence, the flawed clay that I shall sculpt into immortal perfection." He advanced on her, scalpel held aloft like a conductor's baton, a maestro poised to embark on his greatest symphony, an opus writ in blood and abased flesh. Sarah screamed then, a howl of pure animal terror that echoed off the chamber's uncaring walls. She thrashed against her bonds, the ropes cutting into her skin like white-hot wires. Uselessly, hopelessly, a fly caught in a spider's web, its doom long since preordained. The killer loomed over her, an avatar of nightmare made manifest. The torchlight painted his gaunt features in stark chiaroscuro, a death's head grin leering out of the shadows. "Hush now, little bird," he crooned, pressing the scalpel's icy tip to the hollow of her throat. "It'll all be over soon, and then you'll be perfect, forever and always my magnum opus." He began to chant then, guttural syllables that seared the air like a brand. The words of Thorn's ritual, the incantation that would transmute her living flesh into cold, eternal porcelain. And as the scalpel bit into her skin, a line of fire tracing the curve of her jaw, Sarah could only scream and scream and scream. A final futile negation, swallowed by the implacable dark of the labyrinth. No one would hear her. No one was coming to save her. She was alone with the monster, with her worst nightmares made manifest. And now it was time to pay the piper, to surrender herself to the inexorable clockwork of Thorne's madness. It was time to become exquisite. As the world dissolved into a red haze of agony, Sarah's last coherent thought was a prayer to whatever gods might still be listening in this charnel pit at the end of all things. "Let it be quick," she prayed, tears tracking through the blood on her cheeks. "Please, please, let it be quick." And then the darkness rose up to claim her once more, and Sarah Larkin was no more. Chapter 12. The trap is set. She floated in a sea of oblivion, tattered shreds of consciousness swirling around her like leaves in a storm. Time lost all meaning, seconds and centuries bleeding together into an indistinguishable morass. There was only the pain, the white-hot agony that seemed to define the very borders of her being. And beyond that, a bottomless abyss, a yawning void that promised release, surcease, if only she would let herself fall into its waiting arms. It would be so easy to just let go, to surrender to the darkness, to allow herself to dissolve into the merciful nothingness. No more fear, no more suffering, just an endless, dreamless sleep, the peace of utter non-existence. But something held her back, some stubborn spark that refused to be snuffed out, a glimmer of defiance, an ember of rage that smoldered in the very core of her being. She couldn't give up, not now, not after everything she'd endured. If she surrendered now, let the monster win, then all of it would have been for nothing. The lives lost, the horrors witnessed, all just pointless suffering, a sick joke with no punchline. No, she wouldn't let it end like this. Wouldn't let Thorne's scion snuff out her light, twist her into another grotesque trophy in his collection of abominations. She was Sarah Larkin, damn it. A fighter, a survivor. And she would fight, with every last shred of strength left in her broken body. She would fight, until the very end. Slowly, painfully, Sarah dragged herself back to consciousness, back to the world of blood and sweat and flickering torchlight, back to the labyrinth and the horror that waited at its center. The killer was still hunched over her, lost in the throes of his blasphemous ritual. The scalpel flashed in his hand, a questing needle stitching obscenities into her flesh. His eyes were closed, lips moving in a ceaseless, droning chant. He didn't see her eyes flutter open, didn't notice the sudden, sharp intake of breath as she clawed her way back to wakefulness. So lost was he in his rites, in the dark rapture of his great work, that he never saw her hand snake out, never registered the glint of cold metal until it was far, far too late. Sarah had always been a light sleeper, a legacy of too many nights spent in dodgy hostel beds, one eye always open for trouble. It was a habit that had served her well over the years, saved her skin more times than she could count. And now in this nightmare chamber at the edge of oblivion, it would save her once again. The killer's scalpel was sharp, honed to a killing edge. It sliced through the ropes binding her wrists like they were made of gossamer, the fibers parting with barely a whisper. And then, in one smooth, fluid motion, Sarah brought the blade up and buried it to the hilt in the side of the killer's neck. He jerked back, a startled grunt escaping his lips. His hands flew to his throat, eyes widening in shock and dismay. Thick, arterial blood welled between his fingers, black in the guttering torchlight. What have you done?" he gasped, voice little more than a wet, bubbling rattle. "You little bitch, you've ruined everything." But Sarah was already moving, already lurching to her feet on legs that screamed in protest. She snatched up the leather-bound grimoire from where it had fallen, forgotten in the killer's moment of distraction. And then she ran, a stumbling, zigzagging flight through the labyrinth's twisting passages. She didn't know where she was going, didn't have the first clue how to find her way out of this eldritch maze. All she knew was that she had to get away, had to put as much distance as possible between herself and the horror she'd left bleeding out on the chamber floor. Behind her, she could hear the killer's enraged howls echoing off the stone walls, a promise of retribution and bloody vengeance. He would be coming for her now, wounded and maddened, determined to finish what he'd started. But Sarah was determined too. Determined to live, to see the sun again, to make sure that the world knew the truth of what had happened here. the depths of depravity and madness that had festered in the dark heart of New Harmony. She would expose it all, drag every last putrid secret kicking and screaming into the light. And then, when the dust settled and the nightmares receded, she would burn this fucking place to the ground and salt the earth where it had stood. First, though, she had to survive the next few minutes. Had to find her way out of the labyrinth before the killer caught up to her and finished the job. By some miracle, she still had her torch, the feeble light bouncing crazily off the mildewed walls as she ran. It was a slim hope, a trembling lifeline in the infinite dark, but it was all she had. That, and the stubborn, unquenchable fire that burned in her heart, the will to live, to fight, to endure. The trap was set now, the die irrevocably cast. There would be no more hiding, no more running from the truth. She was committed, for better or worse, locked in a mortal struggle with a madman, in a place beyond the edge of reason or mercy. And one way or another, she would see it through to the bitter end, even if it killed her. Chapter 13. Descent into the Lair. Sarah stumbled through the labyrinth in a daze of pain and adrenaline, the feeble light of her torch barely denting the gloom. Every breath was a knife in her lungs, every step an agony that threatened to send her sprawling. But she pushed on, driven by a desperate animal need to survive, to escape the nightmare that nipped at her heels. The killer was close behind her, his rasping breaths and shuffling footsteps echoing off the stone walls like a death knell. He was injured, badly wounded by her desperate gambit with the scalpel, but still he came on, implacable as fate itself, determined to drag her back to that charnel chamber, to finish the dark work she had so rudely interrupted. Sarah shuddered at the thought, nausea rising in her throat. She could still feel the killer's hands on her, still smell his fetid breath as he'd loomed over her supine form, still hear the obscene whisper of Thorne's ritual on his lips, the words that would have unmade her, transformed her into another soulless doll for his collection. No, she wouldn't let him take her, not again. She'd die first, fling herself into the abyss and let the void claim her, before she let that monster lay hands on her again. But she had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of her relentless pursuer. The labyrinth seemed to twist and turn without rhyme or reason, doubling back on itself in maddening, impossible ways. She had no idea how deep she'd descended, how far from the surface world she'd wandered in her frantic flight. All she knew was that she had to keep going, had to find a way out of this eldritch maze before exhaustion and blood loss took their inevitable toll. And then, just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she saw it. A flicker of light up ahead, a faint luminescence that seemed to beckon her onwards like a will-o'-the-wisp. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat, a wild surge of hope that cut through the fog of pain and terror. Could it be? Had she somehow stumbled upon the way out, the path back to sanity and safety? She broke into a shambling run, heedless of the agony that shot through her abused muscles with every jarring impact. The light grew brighter as she approached, resolving into the warm, steady glow of candles, of torches set into braziers along the walls. And then she was staggering into a vast vaulted chamber, a space that seemed to swallow the feeble light whole. Rows of stone columns marched away into the darkness, their capitals carved with leering gargoyles and grotesque capering imps. And there, at the chamber's heart, was the killer's lair, his sanctum sanctorum, the place where he'd planned to complete Thorne's grand work and birth a new age of shrieking nightmare. A stone altar dominated the center of the room, its surface stained and pitted with the residue of decades of unspeakable rites. Arcane symbols were etched into the rock, sigils that seemed to writhe and twist before Sarah's exhausted eyes. And scattered all around, piled in haphazard heaps and teetering stacks, were the dolls. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, a silent congregation of sightless witnesses to the killer's depravity. Sarah recoiled, gorge rising in her throat. They were everywhere, those glassy-eyed simulacra, their porcelain faces frozen in attitudes of mute supplication. Some were pristine, untouched save for the unholy light that seemed to flicker behind their painted eyes, but others bore the marks of their maker's cruel attentions, their delicate features marred by hairline cracks and spidery networks of crazing. And among them, scattered like so much chaff, were the remnants of the killer's previous victims. human teeth and finger bones, knotted clumps of hair and desiccated strips of flesh, all worked into the dolls in a grotesque parody of Thorne's meticulous craftsmanship. It was an abomination, a boneyard marriage of art and atrocity that defied all reason or comprehension. The very air seemed to vibrate with a palpable sense of wrongness, a greasy, rancid weight that pressed down on Sarah's shoulders like an invisible hand. This was the heart of the horror, the wellspring from which all the nightmare of the last few days had flowed. This was where the killer had planned to unmake her, to subsume her identity into his warped vision of twisted perfection. And as Sarah stood there, swaying on her feet like a sapling in a gale, she knew with a sudden awful certainty that there would be no escape, no last-minute reprieve, no deus ex machina to swoop in and snatch her from the jaws of oblivion. She had descended into the very belly of the beast, the black and putrid heart of Thorne's legacy, and now there was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. The killer's footsteps sounded behind her, slow and deliberate, a dolorous knell, tolling her inexorable doom. Sarah turned to face him, tears streaking through the grime on her cheeks. Let him come, then. Let him do his worst, and be damned. She was done running, done fighting a battle she'd never had a chance of winning. All that was left now was to meet her fate head-on, to stare into the abyss without flinching and let it swallow her whole. The killer shambled into the chamber, one hand pressed to the ruin of his throat. Blood soaked his shirt, his skin deathly pale in the guttering torchlight. But his eyes, oh God, his eyes. They blazed with a feverish, unholy light, a madness that seemed to radiate from the very core of his being. The eyes of a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of humanity, who had given himself over wholly and completely to the nightmare that had birthed him. You've led me a merry chase, little bird, he rasped, voice little more than a wet, bubbling rattle. But playtime is over now. It's time to finish what we started, you and I. He took a lurching step forward, hand outstretched. Sarah backed away, heart hammering a war drum beat in her chest. All around her, the dolls seemed to leer and gibber, their sightless eyes drinking in her terror like wine. Why? She croaked, voice cracking on the word. Why me? What have I ever done to you? The killer smiled, a ghastly rictus that split his blood-stained face like a gash. Oh, my sweet Sarah, it was never about you, not really. You were just the vessel, the canvas upon which I would paint my masterpiece. He gestured to the altar, to the stained and pitted stone that had borne witness to so much agony, so much suffering. Don't you see? This is my destiny, the dark birthright that was handed down to me by my forebears. Thorne, my great-grandfather, he was a visionary, a man who dared to push the boundaries of what was possible. He saw the truth that others were too blind or too cowardly to acknowledge. Sarah shook her head, revulsion and disbelief warring in her gut. The truth? What truth could possibly justify this? She swept her arm out, encompassing the charnel horror of the chamber, the silent ranks of the killer's obscene creations. The truth that we are all of us dolls, my dear, the killer hissed, eyes alight with zealous fervor. Mere playthings of the gods, of the vast and uncaring cosmos that birthed us. Our lives are fleeting, our wills illusory. In the end, we dance to strings we cannot see, moved by the whims of forces beyond our comprehension. He took another step forward, blood squelching beneath his feet. But Thorne, he found a way to cut those strings, to seize the reins of his own destiny. He discovered the secret of true immortality, of transcending the prison of flesh and bone and becoming something more, something eternal. Sarah's gorge rose, bile searing the back of her throat. And that secret was this: mutilating innocent people, ripping them apart and stitching them back together like some kind of obscene jigsaw puzzle? Innocent? The killer spat, lips curling in a sneer. There are no innocents, Sarah. Only the deluded and the damned stumbling through the fog of their own ignorance. Thorne saw through that fog, pierced the veil of lies and self-deception that clouds the eyes of lesser men. He understood that the only true path to immortality is through the transmutation of the flesh, the elevation of base matter into something higher, something purer. He gestured to the dolls, to the grim reliquaries of his unspeakable art. Each of these is a masterpiece, Sarah, a work of art that will endure long after the frail shell of its maker has crumbled to dust. They are the legacy of Thorne, the fruition of his grand vision, and I am his anointed heir, the one chosen to carry on his work." Sarah shook her head, horror and revulsion congealing into a hard, cold knot in her chest. "You're insane," she whispered, backing away until her shoulders fetched up against the unyielding stone of the wall. "You're nothing but a monster, a twisted freak who gets off on inflicting pain and suffering." The killer's eyes flashed, a spasm of rage contorting his bloody features. "I am an artist," he roared, spittle flying from his lips, "a visionary just like my great-grandfather before me. And you are nothing but a small, petty creature, too blind to see the glory of what I am creating here." He lunged for her, hands outstretched like claws. Sarah tried to dodge, tried to twist away, but she was too slow, too weakened by pain and exhaustion. The killer's fingers closed around her throat, squeezing with a strength that belied his wounded state. "I had such plans for you, Sarah," he hissed, eyes boring into hers with a fanatic light. "You were to be my magnum opus, the jewel in the crown of my collection. I would have made you immortal, preserved your beauty for all eternity." Sarah clawed at his hands, black spots swarming across her vision as her air was cut off. She could feel herself slipping away, the world narrowing to a tunnel of gray mist and agony. This was it then, the end of the line, the final curtain call. She had fought so hard, struggled so long, but in the end, it had all been for nothing. The monster had won, and she would be damned if she let it end like this. With the last of her strength, Sarah brought her knee up in a vicious jerk, slamming it into the killer's groin with all the force she could muster. He let out a startled grunt, his grip loosening for a split second. And in that second, Sarah wrenched herself free, staggering back as the killer doubled over in pain. She cast about wildly, searching for something, anything she could use as a weapon. There, half hidden behind a toppled pile of dolls, the dull gleam of metal caught her eye. A fire axe, mounted on the wall in case of emergency. Sarah lunged for it, fingers scrabbling at the rusted fixings. Behind her, she could hear the killer's ragged breathing, the wet, meaty sounds of him pulling himself upright. "You little bitch," he snarled, voice thick with rage and pain. "I'm going to fucking gut you. Do you hear me? I'm going to peel the skin from your bones and wear it like a goddamn coat." Sarah's fingers closed around the axe handle, the weight of it solid and reassuring in her grip. She spun to face the killer, teeth bared in a rictus of defiance. "Come on then," she spat, brandishing the axe before her like a talisman. "Come and get me, you sick fuck. Let's finish this once and for all." The killer roared, a sound of pure, bestial fury, and charged, arms outstretched to seize her, to bear her down and rip the life from her body. Sarah screamed, a raw, primal howl that tore itself from the very depths of her being, and swung the axe with every last ounce of strength left in her battered frame. The blade flashed in the guttering torchlight, a silvery arc of divine retribution, and bit deep into the side of the killer's neck, shearing through skin and muscle and tendon with a sickening crunch. The killer's eyes flew wide, shock and disbelief writ large in their feverish depths. He staggered back, hands flying to the ruin of his throat, as a great gout of arterial blood sprayed across the chamber walls. "No!" he gurgled, viscous red bubbling from his lips. This isn't how it was supposed to end." He crashed to his knees, a marionette with its strings cut. Sarah towered over him, the axe held loose and ready at her side. "Funny thing about destiny," she panted, voice raw and ragged. "It has a way of biting you in the ass, when you least expect it." The killer's eyes rolled back in his head, a last rattling breath escaping his ruined throat. He toppled forward, face smashing against the blood-slick flagstones, and lay still, never to rise again. Sarah stared down at his corpse, chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly ebbed from her system. It was over. The nightmare was finally, blessedly over. But even as relief crashed through her in a tidal wave, a small, cold voice whispered in the back of her mind. Was it really over? Could the evil that had festered in this place, in the dark heart of New Harmony, ever truly be vanquished? Or had she merely cut off one head of the Hydra, only for two more to sprout in its place? Sarah shook her head, pushing the thought aside. It didn't matter. Not now, not in this moment of hard-won victory. She had survived. Against all odds, against every twist and turn of the killer's macabre game, she had endured, and that was enough, for now. Turning her back on the carnage, Sarah limped toward the chamber entrance, toward the distant promise of sunlight and sanity. It was time to go home, time to put this whole sordid affair behind her and try to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. But even as she stepped out into the labyrinth, even as the first hint of fresh air caressed her battered face, Sarah knew that she would never be free of this place. Not really. New Harmony had left its mark on her, sunk its claws deep into her psyche, and no matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she tried to forget, the ghosts of Thorn's legacy would always be with her, lurking in the darkest corners of her memory, waiting for the chance to rise again and drag her back down into the nightmare she had fought so hard to escape. But that was a worry for another day, another time. For now, she walked out of the darkness and into the light. Chapter 14. Within the Workshop. The daylight was blinding after so long in the labyrinth's crepuscular gloom, the colors too bright and the edges too sharp. Sarah stumbled out of the maze on legs that trembled with exhaustion, one hand raised to shield her eyes against the merciless sun. All around her, New Harmony drowsed in the late afternoon heat, the streets deserted and the windows shuttered against the day's baleful glare. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what fresh horror might come crawling out of the shadows. Sarah couldn't blame them. After everything she'd seen, everything she'd endured, she half expected the killer to come shambling out of the labyrinth at any moment, his wounds miraculously healed and his eyes burning with fresh madness. But no, that particular nightmare was over, its architect lying cold and dead on the chamber floor. Sarah had made sure of that, had felt the crunch of bone and gristle as the axe bit deep into the killer's neck. She shuddered at the memory, nausea rising in her throat. She had taken a life today, snuffed out a human being as casually as one might swat a fly. Granted, the bastard had deserved it and then some. But still, the knowledge sat heavy in her gut, a leaden weight that dragged at her every step. She was a killer now, a murderer, no matter how justified her actions might have been. That stain would never fully wash away, no matter how hard she scrubbed. But there was no time to dwell on that now, no time to wallow in self-recrimination or guilt. She had a job to finish, a final duty to discharge before she could lay this whole sordid affair to rest. Thorn's workshop, the charnel pit where he had birthed his atrocities, the dark womb from which the killer had slithered forth to terrorize New Harmony anew. She had to go back there, had to see for herself the full extent of the horrors that had been wrought in that eldritch space. And then she had to burn it all down, purge the last lingering traces of Thorn's evil with cleansing fire. It was the only way to be sure, the only way to safeguard against the possibility of the nightmare rising again. As long as that workshop remained, as long as even a single scrap of the killer's foul legacy endured, there would always be the chance of another coming along to claim it, to take up the dark mantle that Thorn and his scion had worn so proudly. No, better to end it now, to cauterize the wound and salt the earth so that nothing could ever grow there again. And so, with a heavy heart and a grim sense of purpose, Sarah turned her steps back toward the old house on the outskirts of town, back toward the wellspring of the nightmare, the beating heart of the horror that had consumed her life. The walk seemed to take forever, and no time at all, the streets blurring together into a featureless smear of sun-baked asphalt and whitewashed clapboard. Sarah moved as if in a dream, her body operating on autopilot while her mind shied away from the task ahead. But all too soon, the house loomed before her, its sagging porch and peeling paint the very picture of desolation. The windows stared out at her like blind, accusing eyes, damning her for her trespass, for the violation she was about to commit. Sarah paused on the threshold, hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She could still turn back, still walk away and leave this benighted place to its demons and its ghosts. But no, she had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn tail now. This ended today, one way or another. Drawing in a deep, shuddering breath, Sarah stepped across the threshold and into the heart of the abyss. The house was just as she remembered it. A labyrinth of dust and decay shot through with an almost palpable aura of wrongness. The air hung thick and heavy, redolent with the sweet, cloying stench of rot and ruin. Sarah picked her way through the detritus, every nerve alight with tension. She half expected the killer to come lunging out at her from every shadowed corner, his eyes alight with fresh madness and his hands grasping for her throat. But the house remained silent and still, a tomb waiting to receive the last of its grim secrets. Sarah moved deeper into the gloom, following the twisting hallway to the door at its end. The workshop, the black heart of Thorne's empire of atrocity, the charnel forge where he had hammered out his unspeakable vision in flesh and bone and porcelain. Sarah's hand shook as she reached for the knob, a cold sweat beating on her brow. She could feel the wrongness emanating from beyond the door, a miasma of despair and desolation that seemed to seep into her very pores. But she couldn't turn back now. Couldn't let the last moldering remnants of Thorne's evil fester in the dark, waiting for the chance to rise again and begin the cycle of horror anew. Gritting her teeth, Sarah wrenched the door open and stepped into her worst nightmare made manifest. The workshop was just as she remembered it from her fevered flight through the labyrinth, a grotesque pastiche of art and atrocity that defied all reason or comprehension. Dolls crowded every surface, their glassy eyes seeming to follow Sarah's every move. Some were pristine, exquisite in their cold, lifeless perfection, but others bore the marks of the killer's cruel attentions, their delicate features marred by spiderweb cracks and hairline fractures, and scattered among them, worked into the very fabric of their being, were the killer's grim trophies, the remnants of his countless victims. Human teeth and shards of bone, desiccated strips of flesh and knotted clumps of hair, all incorporated into the dolls in a nauseating mockery of life. Sarah's gorge rose, bile searing the back of her throat. It was an abomination, a boneyard marriage of the beautiful and the grotesque that spat in the face of all natural law. This was where Thorne had plied his hideous trade, where he had given form to the darkest depths of his twisted psyche. This was where the killer had planned to unmake her, to subsume her identity into his warped vision of obscene perfection. And now it fell to her to put an end to it, to cleanse this charnel pit with fire and consign its horrors to the oblivion they so richly deserved. Sarah cast about for something, anything she could use to start the blaze. There, half hidden behind a workbench, a can of kerosene and a book of matches. The killer's tools, no doubt kept on hand to dispose of any evidence that might link him to his atrocities. How fitting that they should now be turned against him, used to erase the last traces of his foul existence from the world. With shaking hands, Sarah unscrewed the cap and upended the can, splashing the pungent liquid over every surface, every nook and cranny of the workshop. The dolls seemed to scream soundlessly as the kerosene soaked into their porcelain skin, their glass eyes blazing with mute accusation. Sarah paid them no mind. They were abominations, twisted mockeries of life that had no place in the natural order of things. Better that they should burn, that their wrongness should be scoured from the world in a purifying blaze. When the can was empty, Sarah tossed it aside and fumbled for the matchbook. Her hands were slick with sweat, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she struck match after match, watching them gutter and die in the kerosene-soaked air. Finally, one caught, flaring to life with a hiss and a crackle. Sarah stared at the dancing flame, mesmerized by its primal beauty, by the promise of destruction held within its flickering heart. This was it, the moment of truth, the point of no return. Once she let that flame fly, there would be no going back, no chance to undo what had been done. But what choice did she have? This place, this workshop of horrors, it was a cancer, a festering wound on the soul of New Harmony. As long as it endured, as long as even a single trace of Thorne's legacy remained, the evil that had claimed so many lives would never truly be vanquished. Drawing in a deep, shuddering breath, Sarah touched the match to the kerosene-soaked floor and watched as the flames roared to life, hungry and eager. They raced across the room in a matter of seconds, licking at the walls and clawing at the ceiling. The dolls ignited like dry tinder, their porcelain faces cracking and blackening in the heat. Sarah stumbled back, choking on the thick, oily smoke that filled the air. The flames were everywhere now, a roaring inferno that consumed everything in its path. She had to get out, had to escape before the whole place came crashing down around her ears. But some perverse fascination held her rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the conflagration she had unleashed. There was a terrible beauty to it, a savage, visceral thrill in watching the last remnants of Thorn's evil consumed by the hungry flames. This was more than mere destruction. It was purification, a scouring away of all that was foul and unclean in the world. And as Sarah stood there, wreathed in smoke and ash, she felt something deep within her give way, some last lingering vestige of the fear and horror that had gripped her for so long. She was free, free of Thorn, free of the killer, free of the nightmare that had haunted her every waking moment for what felt like an eternity. The flames roared higher, the heat searing her skin and singeing her hair. Sarah barely noticed, lost in the fierce, exultant joy of her newfound liberation. But then, through the smoke and the crackle of the flames, she heard it. A sound that froze the blood in her veins, a sound that had no place in this world of fire and ash. Laughter, high-pitched and mocking, drifting out from the heart of the inferno like the demented giggle of a madman, and beneath it, almost lost in the roar of the flames, a voice whispering her name. "Sarah," it crooned, the syllables dripping with malice and dark amusement. "Did you really think it would be that easy? Did you think you could escape me so readily after all we've shared?" Sarah's heart seized in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The killer was dead, his body cooling on the chamber floor half a mile away. But that voice, oh God, that voice, she knew it all too well, had heard it whispering in her nightmares for longer than she cared to remember. "Silly little Sarah," the voice chuckled, the sound like nails on a blackboard. "So naive, so arrogant in your assumptions. Did you really believe that death would be enough to stop me? That the paltry shell of flesh you destroyed was all there was to my existence?" Sarah shook her head frantically, denial and horror warring in her gut. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some trick of the mind, some last, lingering fragment of the madness that had gripped her for so long. But deep down, in some dark, secret corner of her soul, she knew the truth, knew it with a certainty that turned her blood to ice water in her veins. The killer wasn't dead. He had never been just a man, never been bound by the frail limitations of mortal flesh. He was something more, something older and darker and infinitely more malevolent. A presence that had sunk its claws into New Harmony long before she was born. A cancerous evil that had festered in the town's heart for generations. And now it had come for her, rising from the ashes of its own destruction to claim the prize it had sought for so long. Sarah tried to run, tried to force her legs to carry her out of this nightmare and back to the safety of the world above. But it was no use. Some unseen force held her pinned in place, as helpless and immobile as a fly in amber. The flames parted like a curtain, and there, standing amid the smoking ruins, was the killer. His flesh hung in charred tatters from his bones, his eyes two pits of infinite darkness in the ruin of his face. But he was smiling, a rictus grin that split his blackened lips and bared his gleaming teeth. And in his hand, held aloft like a trophy, was a doll, a perfect porcelain effigy, its delicate features a mirror image of Sarah's own. "Do you see now, my sweet?" the killer purred, his voice a sepulchral rasp over the crackle of the flames. "Do you understand the futility of your struggles, the inevitability of your fate?" He took a step forward, the doll held out before him like an offering. "You were always meant for this, Sarah. Meant to be the crowning jewel in my collection, the masterpiece that would cement my legacy for all eternity." Sarah shook her head, mute horror robbing her of speech. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by smoke inhalation and sheer mind-numbing terror. But the killer's touch was real enough as he caressed her cheek, his fingers cold and clammy against her skin, and the doll in his hand. Oh God, the doll. It was moving, twitching and jerking like a thing possessed, its glass eyes rolling in their sockets as it turned to face her. And behind those eyes, glinting in the hellish light of the flames, was an intelligence. A cruel, malevolent awareness, as old as time and twice as pitiless. The doll's lips parted, and Sarah heard her own voice whispering out from between them, a perfect melodious replica, untouched by the smoke and the horror that choked her throat. "Welcome home, Sarah," it crooned, the words dripping with a hideous, mocking arousal. "We've been waiting for you for so very, very long." And then the killer was pressing the doll into her hands, forcing her numb fingers to close around its cool, unyielding porcelain. And Sarah felt something, some last vital spark of herself, gutter and die in that moment. As the darkness rose up to claim her, and the world fell away into a roaring sea of flame and shadow, the last thing she saw, before the blackness took her, was her own face staring back at her from the doll's glassy eyes. Her own face, and behind it, grinning out from the depths of forever, the face of the killer, triumphant at last. Epilogue. New Harmony slept, oblivious and uncaring as the fire raged on the edge of town. By the time the blaze guttered out, the old house was little more than a smoking ruin. Its rotting timbers collapsed into a heap of blackened debris. Of Sarah Larkin, no trace remained. No body, no smoldering bones to mark her passing. It was as if she had never existed at all, vanished into the flames like a wisp of smoke on the wind. The official story, when the ashes had cooled and the questions begun, was tragedy. A troubled young woman, pushed to the brink by her obsessions, had taken her own life in a fit of madness. Case closed. Just another sad footnote in the long, troubled history of a town with more than its share of secrets and lies. But sometimes, in the dark of the moon when the shadows grew long and the nightmares walked, the locals would whisper of other things, of dark deeds and unspeakable rituals, of a legacy of evil that reached back to the very founding of the town. They would talk of the reclusive old doll maker and his unnaturally beautiful creations, of the countless disappearances that seemed to dog his footsteps like a faithful hound. And they would speak, in hushed and fearful tones, of the girl, the outsider, the interloper who had sought to unravel the mysteries of the past, only to be consumed by them in the end. Some even claimed to have seen her, on the darkest of nights when the veil between worlds grew thin and tattered. A pale, wraith-like figure, wandering the streets of New Harmony with a haunted, hunted look in her eyes, and clutched in her arms, held fast against her breast like a macabre parody of a child, a doll, a perfect porcelain effigy, its face a mirror image of her own. But such tales were the stuff of ghost stories and old wives' tales, fit only for the telling around midnight campfires and over too many drinks at the local bar. The truth, as always, was doubtless far more prosaic. A troubled mind, pushed to the breaking point by isolation and obsession. A life cut tragically short, a bright flame snuffed out before its time. And if sometimes, in the dark hours of the night, the locals thought they heard the sound of laughter on the wind, high-pitched and mocking, drifting out from the ruins of the old house like the demented giggle of a madman, well, surely it was only the trick of an overactive imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights and too much idle gossip. There were no such things as ghosts after all, no vengeful spirits to haunt the living, no restless dead to trouble the sleep of the innocent. The past was the past, dead and buried and best left undisturbed. And if the people of New Harmony clung to their secrets, hugged their lies close to their chests like a miser with his gold, who could blame them, really? There were some truths, after all, that were simply too terrible to be borne, some horrors too dark and twisted to be dragged out into the light of day. Better to let sleeping demons lie, to leave the dead to their rest and the living to their willful blindness. Better to embrace the comforting veil of ignorance than to risk gazing upon the face of true evil, and being forever changed by what one saw there. The end.